The first Native Americans didn't just arrive on a new continent, they stepped into a world unlike anything we can imagine today. Picture a land filled with towering giants, mammoths as tall as buildings, saber-tooth cats with dagger-like teeth, and ground sloths the size of buses. These weren't just animals, they were like creatures out of ancient myths, titans of a forgotten era, armed with little more than stone tools and unshakable bravery. Our ancestors faced beasts powerful enough to crush boulders and shake the earth. Every hunt wasn't just about survival, it was an epic battle against nature's most formidable creations. Each victory was a monumental achievement, like something straight out of legend. This was humanity's first great saga, written in tracks as big as a person and in blood as old as time itself. Take, for example, horses, a creature we often associate with the wild mustangs of the American West. However, those modern horses are actually descendants of animals brought to the Americas by European settlers. The original horses native to the Americas disappeared thousands of years earlier. During the Pleistocene epoch, North and South America were home to a variety of native horses. These included Equus scotti, a species about the size of modern horses, but with a noticeably larger head, and Hippodion, a genus of horse, adapted to mountainous regions in South America. One of the most fascinating of these ancient horses was Equus conversitans, often called the Mexican horse. It stood about 1.4 meters tall and was one of the last native horses before their extinction, standing about 6 feet tall at the shoulder. Equus conversitans was smaller than modern horses, closer in size to a large pony. Despite its modest stature, this ancient horse thrived in the diverse environments of North America, from open grasslands to rugged mountains. Early Native Americans likely encountered these horses and may have hunted them for food, much like they did with other large animals of the era. However, around 11,000 years ago, Equus conversitans went extinct, and its disappearance significantly impacted the ecosystems it once shaped. These horses played an important role in maintaining grasslands, and their loss forced Native Americans to adapt to a changing environment. When Europeans reintroduced horses to the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries, they unknowingly restored a crucial piece of the continent's ecological puzzle, bringing balance back to the grasslands. But where prey-roamed predators followed, one of the most fearsome hunters of the Pleistocene was the direwolf. These formidable predators likely targeted herds of native horses, taking advantage of their numbers and their herd behavior. Despite its name and popular portrayals, the direwolf wasn't just a larger version of today's wolves. It didn't even belong to the same genus. Instead, it was part of a distinct lineage of canines known as Anocendiris. While it looked wolf-like, the direwolf was closer in size to a large mountain lion with a broad, powerful skull and teeth designed for crushing bone. The direwolf was a predator built for strength. Weighing up to 150 pounds, it was stockier and more robust than modern wolves, making it well suited to hunting the massive animals that roamed the Ice Age. The direwolf likely hunted very differently from modern wolves. Today's wolves are built for endurance, chasing down prey in coordinated packs. In contrast, the direwolf's powerful, stocky build suggests it relied more on ambush tactics. It would have been capable of short, explosive bursts of speed to close in on its target. Once it caught its prey, the direwolf's immense jaw strength delivered a devastating bite. Research even suggests it had the most powerful bite of any canine species. Like modern wolves, direwolves lived and hunted in packs, which made them even more formidable. For early Native Americans, encountering a pack of direwolves would have been a truly terrifying experience, a shadow in the night that could instill fear even in the bravest warriors. Both humans and direwolves depended on large prey like bison horses and mammoths for survival, leading to competition between them. At times, they may have scavenged from each other's kills, creating a dynamic of both rivalry and mutual respect. Recent genetic studies have uncovered something surprising. Direwolves were far more distinct from gray wolves than previously thought. They were so genetically different that they couldn't interbreed with other canine species. This isolation might have contributed to their extinction, as they were unable to adapt through hybridization, a survival strategy that benefited some other species. Despite their strength in hunting prowess, direwolves were not invincible. The end of the last ice age brought a changing climate and the extinction of the megafauna they relied on. Without their primary food sources, the mighty direwolves were unable to survive and ultimately disappeared. The last direwolves disappeared about 9,000 years ago, leaving behind only fossils and myths. While they relied on speed and power to survive, another prehistoric creature used an entirely different strategy, its own built-in shield. Meet the glyptodon, a walking fortress that looked like a mix between an armadillo and an ant. This heavily armored creature roamed the Americas during the Pleistocene epoch and survived until about 11,000 years ago, overlapping with the arrival of early humans. Glyptodons were part of a family of armored mammals, distantly related to today's armadillos. But don't let the comparison fool you. This was no ordinary armadillo. Imagine an animal the size of a small car weighing nearly 2,000 pounds encased of a massive domed shell made of bony plates. Now picture an early human stumbling across one thinking it was a boulder, only to discover it was a very annoyed living tank. The glyptodon's most remarkable feature was its armor, a dome-shaped shell composed of hundreds of interlocking bony plates called os. This natural defense was so strong, it could deflect the claws and teeth of most predators, making their glyptodon nearly invincible in its environment. But its shell wasn't just for protection. Recent research suggests the armor also helped regulate body temperature, allowing the glyptodon to thrive in different climates and adapt to its surroundings. The glyptodon's defenses didn't stop at its thick armor. Its tail, reinforced with bony rings, was likely a powerful weapon. Imagine a club the size of a small tree trunk capable of delivering bone-shattering blows. This formidable tail could fend off predators and rivals alike, making the glyptodon a true tank of the prehistoric world. Despite its intimidating appearance, the glyptodon was actually a peaceful herbivore. It mainly fed on vegetation, particularly grasses, using its strong jaws and flat teeth to grind tough plant material. This diet meant humans had no reason to fear it as a predator, but its massive size and defensive features would have made it a formidable challenge for early hunters. Evidence suggests that humans did hunt glyptodon. Archaeological sites have revealed glyptodon bones bearing marks from tools indicating butchery. Interestingly, some researchers speculate that early humans may have repurposed the glyptodon's massive shells as temporary shelters, a kind of prehistoric mobile home. Beyond their interactions with humans, glyptodons played a vital role in their ecosystems. As they grazed, they helped maintain open grasslands, likely shaping the landscape in ways that benefited other species, including humans. It's easy to imagine early Native Americans coexisting peacefully with these slow-moving giants, marveling at their resilience and strength. However, not all creatures of the Ice Age were as tranquil as the glyptodon. Some, like the next animal, would have inspired terror in anyone who crossed their path. The Smilodon, famously known as the saber-tooth cat, was a predator like no other. Its most iconic feature, the elongated canine teeth, has made it the symbol of the Pleistocene epoch. However, let's dispel a common myth. These teeth weren't fragile, like delicate daggers. They were thick, strong, and more comparable to railway spikes than fine blades. In the largest species, Smilodon, these impressive canines could reach up to 11 inches long. But the Smilodon's fearsome reputation wasn't just about appearance. It was also one of the most powerful predators of its time. Smilodon populator, the largest of the 3 known species, could weigh as much as a small adult Kodiak bear. The other species, though smaller, were still massive by today's standards. For example, Smilodon fatalis, the species that likely encountered early Native Americans, could weigh up to 600 pounds. Even Smilodon gracilis, the smallest of the 3, was about the size of a modern jaguar. One of the Smilodon's most striking features was its powerful forelimbs, which were significantly larger than its hind limbs. This gave it a unique build and played a key role in its hunting strategy. Unlike modern big cats, which killed by biting the throat and suffocating their prey, the Smilodon had a different method. Its skull wasn't designed for the sustained pressure of a prolonged bite. Instead, the Smilodon used its muscular front legs to pin its prey to the ground. Once mobilized, it delivered a quick, devastating bite with its saber teeth, targeting the neck or belly for a swift kill. This combination of strength, precision, and its remarkable anatomy made the Smilodon one of the most specialized and fearsome predators of its era. The Smilodon's hunting strategy allowed it to take down prey much larger than itself, including bison, camels, and even young mammoths. However, its specialized arsenal came with significant risks. Those long canines, while deadly, were prone to breaking. For a Smilodon, Losing its teeth was often a death sentence, as it couldn't hunt effectively without them. Injured or elderly smilodons frequently faced starvation, unable to survive on their own. But recent discoveries have revealed a surprising aspect of their lives. They may have lived in social groups, much like modern lions. Fossil evidence suggests that these saber-tooth cats cared for injured, weak, or elderly members of their group. Some fossils show individuals with severe injuries, such as broken bones or damaged teeth, that healed over time. These injuries would have made survival impossible without help, indicating that healthy smilodons likely shared food or provided protection to those who couldn't fend for themselves. This level of cooperation paints a more complex picture of smilodon behavior, showing them as not just fearsome predators, but also social animals capable of caring for one another. For early Native Americans, the smilodon would have been both a terrifying predator and a formidable rival. While there's no direct evidence that humans hunted smilodons, it's hard to imagine they didn't cross paths. Both species competed for the same prey, and a hungry smilodon might not have been too selective about its next meal, human or otherwise. The smilodon wasn't the only predator early Native Americans had to face. If anything could rival the saber-toothed cat in size and sheer intimidation, it was the short-faced bear, scientifically known as Arctodecimus. This wasn't just a big bear, it was the largest terrestrial carnivorous mammal to ever walk the earth. A member of the trademark Tini subfamily, today represented only by the spectacle bear. Arctidus included two known species, Arctidus prestinus and Arctidus simus. Of these, Arctidus simus was the species that roamed alongside early humans, surviving in what is now the United States, until about 12,800 years ago. Arctidus simus was not only the last surviving species, but also the largest. It could weigh up to an astonishing 2,100 pounds, surpassing even some medium-sized theropods, like pteropods. But its immense weight was only part of what made it so extraordinary. With its towering frame, the short-faced bear was a true giant. Standing on all fours, it reached eye level with an adult human. When it stood upright on its hind legs, it could stretch up to 11 feet, 3.4 meters tall, making it a colossal presence in the prehistoric landscape. The name short-faced bear doesn't mean its snout was especially short. Instead, the name comes from the shape of its skull, which appeared shorter and more compact compared to other bears when viewed from the side. Its skull, combined with unusually long legs, gave it a distinctive appearance, setting it apart from its bear relatives. But size and appearance weren't the only remarkable things about the short-faced bear. Its adaptations made it a truly unique and formidable predator in its time, capable of dominating its environment and competing with other apex predators like this. The short-faced bear was a prehistoric giant built for speed and endurance. Its long limbs and specialized heel structure suggest it was highly efficient at covering vast distances, whether chasing prey or scavenging for prey. Some researchers even propose it could reach speeds of up to 40 miles per hour in short bursts, a remarkable feat for such a massive animal. However, the exact diet of the short-faced bear has long been debated. While its enormous size and fearsome appearance suggest it was a predator, studies of its teeth and skull structure indicate it may have been more of an omnivore, similar to modern bears. It likely used its size and speed to intimidate other predators and scavenge their kills, supplementing its diet with vegetation when meat was scarce. For early Native Americans, encountering a short-faced bear must have been both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Imagine standing face-to-face with a bear twice the size of a grizzly, capable of outrunning any human. Such encounters likely left a deep impression, sparking myths and stories that were passed down for generations, even after the bear's extinction. Interestingly, evidence suggests that humans and short-faced bears may have competed directly for resources, including shelter. Archaeological studies of caves in North America reveal alternating signs of human and bear occupation over thousands of years. This competition for living space and other resources may have contributed to the eventual decline and extinction of the short-faced bear. While some ancient creatures posed serious threats, others stood out for their sheer size, true giants of the prehistoric world. Among these were the mammoths and mastodons, distant relatives of today's elephants. These massive, trumped mammals roamed the continent in large numbers, shaping the landscape and leaving a lasting impression on the cultural memory of early Native Americans. Native Americans would have encountered several species of these giants, including the Columbian mammoth, woolly mammoth, pygmy mammoth, and the American mastodon. Most of these creatures were enormous, except for the pygmy mammoth, which became much smaller due to island dwarfism after being isolated on the Channel Islands. At first glance, mammoths and mastodons might seem similar, but they were distinct creatures adapted to different environments. Mammoths, belonging to the genus Mammoths, were grazers that thrived in open grasslands and tundra. In contrast, mastodons, part of the genus Mammoth, were browsers, preferring forested areas where they fed on trees and shrubs. The Columbian mammoth, Mammothus columbi, was the largest of North America's mammoths. It could stand up to 14 feet tall at the shoulder and weigh as much as 10 tons, making it one of the most colossal land animals of its time. Its better-known relative, the woolly mammoth, was slightly smaller, but better equipped for cold climates thanks to its thick, shaggy coat. Mastodons, often confused with mammoths, were stockier and more robust. Their bodies were built for navigating forested environments, giving them a different appearance and ecological role compared to the more slender and grassland-adapted mammoths. The American mastodon stood about 10 feet tall and had tusks that curved gently upward, a less dramatic curve compared to the sweeping tusks of mammoths. These massive creatures, like their mammoth relatives, were protected by incredibly thick skin, and in the case of the woolly mammoth and mastodon, dense fur coats added extra insulation against the cold, while also serving as a defense against predators. Mammoths and mastodons were vital to their ecosystems. As they roamed, grazing on vegetation, they shaped the environment by clearing forests and dispersing seeds through their dung. This environmental engineering created habitats that benefited other species, including early humans. For Native Americans, these giant proboscideans were more than just organs. They were invaluable resources. A single mammoth, or a mastodon, could feed an entire tribe for weeks, and their bodies provided more than just meat. Their hides could be used for shelter, their bones for tools, and their ivory for crafting artwork and weapons. The Clovis people, famous for their distinctively crafted spear points, were particularly skilled at hunting mammoths. Archaeological sites across North America revealed numerous mammoth kill sites, highlighting their expertise in taking down these enormous creatures. Mammoths and mastodons also left a lasting imprint on Native American culture and mythology. Many indigenous oral traditions feature stories of giant beasts resembling these prehistoric elephants, suggesting their memory lived on long after the animals themselves had vanished. Another fascinating creature from this era, though less fearsome, was Camelops, a prehistoric camel. While the name might not sound particularly thrilling, Camelops was unique for one key reason. It was a camel living in North America, a surprising sight by today's standards. Camelops was a true camel, but its exact appearance remains uncertain because soft tissue, like humps, didn't fossilize. We don't know if it had one hump, two humps, or none at all. What we do know is that it was taller than modern camels, standing about 20% higher at the shoulder due to its long, slender legs. Like its modern relatives, Camelops was a grazer, thriving on coarse shrubs and grasses, as it roamed vast areas, primarily in the western United States. However, fossil evidence shows its range extended as far east as Tennessee. These long-distance travels occasionally brought Camelops into contact with Native Americans, who sometimes hunted it. Despite its smaller size compared to other megafauna and its lack of natural defenses, Camelops doesn't appear to have been hunted as frequently as creatures like mammoths or mastodons. Fossil evidence suggests that Camelops wasn't a primary target for early humans. Another fascinating creature that early Native Americans likely encountered, but seemed to have left largely undisturbed, was the giant beaver. True to its name, the giant beaver was enormous. Some individuals reached up to 7.2 feet in length and weighed about 3 times as much as a modern German shepherd. Their oversized bodies would have been an incredible sight, made even more striking by their massive incisors, which were about the size of half a ruler. Unlike modern beavers, their teeth were textured, though the reason for this unique feature remains a mystery. What truly set the giant beaver apart was its powerful bite. Its deep, broad jaws suggested it could exert tremendous force, likely to cut through tough wood or to defend itself from predators. Despite its size, Castorades was a skilled swimmer, equipped with a long tail and webbed hind feet. Unlike today's beavers, Castorades primarily fed on aquatic plants, indicating it was even more adapted to a semi-aquatic lifestyle. This water-based existence may have limited its interactions with humans, as evidence of direct contact is scarce. However, one fossil site has been discovered where giant beaver remains were found alongside human artifacts, hinting at occasional encounter. Sadly, these massive creatures vanished from the Earth around 11,000 years ago, becoming part of the wave of extinctions that claimed many remarkable animals of the Pleistocene era. Click on the video on the screen to keep learning with our content.